the three watersheds in UMass Boston. Before we begin, I just want to allow people to ask any questions or have any input that they want, and so I might get some sense of questions or ideas that I hadn't anticipated. Does anybody have anything they want to say or comment on before we get going? All right, I'll just proceed. And for some of you may have come to the official Pie River meeting that was back in November and seen some of these first slides, and I had prepared more, not knowing exactly how much time I had. And basically this is to go over that material and repost it so that people will see a slightly updated version. What I'm showing here is a picture of the marsh surrounding the wells, one of the wellheads in Georgetown, and you can see that the marsh has gone dry. And this occurred this summer dramatically. Why isn't it advancing? Here we go. Try this button. There we go. And as a backdrop that I want you to keep in mind, the underlying problem is that people have taken water without thinking of its consequences. And this is a particularly stark reminder of that. These signs we see around Georgetown, in which people are advertising the fact that they're not part of the water system in Georgetown, and therefore somehow they it seems they should be able to pump as much water as they want. That's sort of the implication. Whereas they all have their straws in the same water supply. It's all a public water supply, and we need, as a community, to come to that understanding. And furthermore, we need to think about what the consequences are for the environment. We all depend on the environment to support us, and water is one of the most important resources we get. We don't pay for the water itself or its consequences on the environment. We just pay for the processing and delivery of the water. And even that's something that we have a hard time committing to. In other words, our water infrastructure is old and not very well, not in that good shape. And the people who are responsible for maintaining it don't get as much support. It's one of those things where we say, well, we want the water and we don't want to pay for it. At least that's my opinion. We do pay for it, but not as much as we should. Okay, here's just some pictures of droughts that we took this summer, various parts around the watershed. And it's not so critical where it is. I can tell people where it is if they want, but it's just the fact that things got really dry, as you all are aware probably, because your lawns turned brown, and you got repeated notices to see what was going on. I want to acknowledge the fact that most of the data I'm going to show today and analyze comes from the USGS, which maintains the gauges, river gauges around the country, and their data are very well curated, and it's easy to get them and use them, and that's a great help to understand these problems. There are two sites now in operation. USGS has this site for the Parker River, and they have where you can get this kind of information. This is showing a particular day, a statistic, and which you have the low value, have the lowest value recorded. You have the 75th percentile, the median, 75th percentile, mean, and highest value. And so there's great variability in this flow of the river. This is 4 orders of magnitude. But on this particular day, when I did it for the Parker, it's lower than the lowest value ever recorded. It was 0.27 cubic feet per second. And you can easily get this kind of graph, so you can see what's going on. And it shows a particular day. I had my cursor there, so it gave this day of 43.6 cubic feet per second in January. And then it shows the rest of the data. Oh, sorry, it's my bad hands here. And you can see that the flow descends in the spring, and then during the summer it's quite low. And here it actually goes to zero, and then these events are some rainfalls, and then it pops back up, and then it went down. And these long durations of very, very low flow are unusual. It usually doesn't get that low. This past season was quite a drought. And here's the old page. So you can see that there's another place that they've maintained, another website where you can still get the data. And they have extensive information about what it covers and how they maintain it. So it's scientifically, it's very helpful. I should say, if anybody has a question or a comment, just speak right up, and we can go along and have a discussion. This is what happens when you plot the data, all the data through time, starting from the 40s all the way through the 2000s. And when you see this, it doesn't look like there's much to see. It kind of looks the same. Perhaps one can see that there might be increased variability after 1980. There are certainly half a dozen peaks where the flow gets really high. And there are also, but at the low end, it's very hard to see. The data are quite compact, and with all the data plotted, it's just without other ways of visualizing the data, it's hard to know what's going on. So I replotted the data by month, and I also plotted it on log axes. So that means that you can see the low flow, which is really what's concerning us. And the flow actually does go to zero. You can't show that on a log axis plot, but and what that means is that the gauge can't read any flow. And that's why these lower lines here, I don't know if my arrow here, my arrow is here. You can see these flat lines here. Those are because the gauge reads in these increments. It can't read in finer increments. And so it's reading at a very lowest increment here, and then another increment, but it will read zero eventually. Oh, the other thing to note is that there are these peaks you can see up here, and it suddenly jumps up and then decays slowly. And those are the result of large rain or snow melt events. And it's very typical to get a sudden rise and then a slow decay. Here's the first evidence that we have of that there's increasing low flow. What I've done is I've picked 3 different categories of flow: less than 1 cubic feet per foot per second, less than 0.1 cubic foot per second, or less than 0.1 cubic feet per second. And I've highlighted this by month. So December, this color variant here is by month. And then I've plotted this across all the years that we have data for. And when you look at the less than 1 cubic foot per second, you see that there's quite a few early days when that happens. Here we have, for instance, in about 1964 or 5, there was a time when there were about 120 days when the flow was less than 1 foot per second, cubic foot per second. And one can sort of say that it seems to be more common after maybe 1990. There seem to be more days when there's flow less than 1 cubic foot per second. This becomes more obvious when you look at flow less than 1.1 cubic feet per second. There's only one group of days down here, but up here there's lots of days. And then finally, at this last category that I investigated, less than 0.01 cubic feet per second, it's only in 2016 and 2022 when that occurred. Here there are approximately 12 days or 13 days, and here there's almost 20. So I can't quite read that. Yeah, almost 20 days when it was less than 0.01. So this suggests that low flow is becoming more common. All right. And to understand that a little bit more, I picked out certain years where there was low flow, and I plotted them alone. And I also computed the minimum flow. This purplish color here is this boundary. That's the boundary for all the years. And then it's still a little hard to see. The time of year when it's really low flow is June to November. So I have this little rectangle here. And in the next slide, we're just going to focus on that to see it a little bit more. And here's that same segment of the graph blown up. And you can see, follow particular years there. And for instance, in 2001, this gold color comes down and it's low, it's low, it's low. And right here, it might be when it was the lowest, but then it pops back up. If you look at 2022, that's this purplish color. It's not the lowest in here. It's coming down, it's low, but in here, it's the lowest, could be the lowest one. That could also be 2016. It's not obvious there. 2016 is here. That's 2022, the lowest there. And then it pops up in 2016 is the lowest. So you can just get a better feel for what's going on there. And I looked at just the number of days, and I could count in a couple different ways because of the way the software worked. And here you can see the number of days by year, excuse me. The number of days by year. And so there are some days here where you have record low flow. I'm sorry, I can't, just a second. And here we have even, this continues on to the here, starting in 1999 through 2022. And you can see the number of days, and by either method rapidly increases in these years with low flow. So there's many more days here by either method in which you have really low flow than compared to the 40s, even through the 1990s. There were a couple years in here where things were pretty low, but nothing like compared to 2016 and 2022. So the question is that we do have evidence that there's drought and that it's increasing, and just by looking at the river, you see that the river no longer is a river. It becomes a series of pools at best, and some kind, and a large extent of it just becomes a dry riverbed. So what are the causes? It could be natural variation, hydrological variables. It could be that people are withdrawing water from the aquifer, or because of differences in land use practices. And it could be related to, so that would be a local kind of effect, B, or it could be something related to climate change, more of a global impact. And I don't have answers to these yet, but I'm going to suggest that people withdrawing water does impact the river. And to do that, I want to start by getting us to compare units. So far, I've been talking in cubic feet per second. That's what the US gauge talks about. But usually when you read about or see figures for water withdrawal, it's in gallons. So my first question is, if you have a cubic foot per second is a low flow rate in the park or in the river, what's the equivalent of, that's the equivalent of about 7.5 gallons per second of pumping rate. If a person uses 50 gallons a day, that means this flow rate could provide one person's water needs in 6.7 seconds. So 1 cubic foot per second could provide for 10 people in 1 minute and 7 seconds. So that's pretty good. And that means that 1 cubic foot per second of flow can provide the water for 12 to 13,000 people per day. So that seems great. Well, how does that translate into health for the river? Well, here's a graph showing how much water is extracted by Georgetown. And in the winter months, that's about 500 gallons per day, 500,000 gallons per day. You know, in here it's 500. And then I'm too sensitive on the keyboard here, sorry. But in the summer, it could get up to 1 million gallons a day. So double this rate in summer. And that's when we want to water our lawns. It's when we have swimming pools. It's when we have gardens to water. And I'm sensitive to this, of course, because I live right next to the Parker River in Georgetown, and I get my water from this water supply. So I understand how important the water is for people, and that we're used to living a certain way. But we're coming up against boundaries now where it's compromising the health of the ecosystem. So what are the pumping rates here? Well, I've told you, does that matter? The aquifer in Georgetown, from which they draw the water, is right below the river. It's sand and gravel deposit. So by taking water out for people, it directly affects the river. And water that would be coming from other parts of the watershed are trickling down into that aquifer. Roughly speaking, when the town pumps 500 gallons per day in the cooler months with a population of 8,400 people, that's 5.8 gallons per second, or 0.77 cubic feet per second. So in the winter, when the river's flowing often at 10 cubic feet per second, that's only 8% of the flow. That doesn't seem like too much. 8% of the flow, it's important, it's something, but it's not a large fraction. However, when we repeat that calculation in the summer, the amount of pumping is double that. It's 1 million gallons per day. And with a population of 8,400 people, that's 11.6 gallons per second, or 1.55 cubic feet per second, compared to the river flow of 1 cubic foot per second. So that's 150% of what's in the river. So if the river flow is only 1 cubic foot per second, Georgetown is taking 1.5 times that. Now, the actual amount of flow in the river is measured well downstream of Georgetown. We don't have any data for the flow right in Georgetown, but it's likely to be much less. So that means that the flow in the river is rapidly being impacted by our pumping. So summertime is the time when we have to be concerned about the river health. That's because the demand is doubled and the river flow is much smaller. So it's the summertime when we need to be concerned based on this analysis so far. And that's going to stand no matter what happens. Okay, so here's a way I like to think about it. I don't know if this is helpful to other people, but what I plotted is the ratio of the river flow times the water extracted. And when it's in this zone of 10 to 100, it doesn't matter much. But when it gets less than 10 times, and when it gets less than 1, it really matters. So in these past years, 2021 is up at the top. It didn't matter at all. We had a very wet summer, and there was abundant water, and people didn't need water because for their lawns because it rained so much. They had people coming to mow their lawn every week, and they could use water from the Georgetown public water supply to fill their swimming pools, and it didn't matter much. But in 2022, it's not that way at all. It became much lower in terms of the amount of water we had, and so the ratio got much less. And it's that kind of ratio that might inform people. For some people, ratios are hard to understand. I'm not sure that's the best way to communicate it, but it helps me. Okay, I'm been talking for about 20 minutes, and the rest now is just to talk about how we could investigate this further. What would be a sensible way to go on with this? And hydrologists have conceptual frameworks to study water needs of communities and the water cycle. And it's based on this marvelous idea, conservation of mass. And this may sound very academic to you, like something you remember in physics, and indeed that's what it is. It's just that outside of atomic reactions, mass is conserved. So what we need to do is look for the sources and sinks of water movement in and out of the watershed, and try to name them and measure them, and then we can understand how the flow in the river is being affected by these different aspects of water in a very systematic way. That will help us do two things. It'll help us understand what's happening with our water supply and how it's impacting the river. And it will also eventually allow us to forecast the condition of the river in real time, I would think. And furthermore, it's going to let us identify sources of uncertainty. As we were to refine models, there's always going to be uncertainty because our ability to measure things is limited. We don't have infinite budgets, and water moves in many ways. But I hope many people on the who are listening appreciate the ability to forecast weather, how much that has improved as we've gotten better models. And the same applies to predicting flow in the rivers in Massachusetts. As we get more data, we'll be able to do a better job of actually predicting the real-time flow. So I just want to review with you the hydrological cycle. This is a general diagram you could find on the web, in which it talks about precipitation as a rainfall. It's running off into lakes. It's evaporating from the lakes. Some of it, however, goes into the ground and becomes part of groundwater. It will also pass from the ground through plants in a process called transpiration. And that rain is the ultimate origin of the water that runs in our rivers. There are several places in which it can be lost through evaporation, transpiration, but eventually it goes back to the ocean, and from which the water comes back to the land. And there are arrows here suggesting there's shorter circuits back to precipitation, and we all know that soil dries out and we have to water it for our gardens. And so it seems pretty simple. If we look at a more formal model for the land, it starts to become a little bit more complex. We have the big input of precipitation. the water is ponded. It can then be lost through evapotranspiration. There's a top layer of soil. There's another zone in which water is held, but it doesn't, it's not saturated. And finally, there's a saturation zone. Water can flow out from the saturated zone to the river link, and it can flow over the top of the soil in runoff. This is, I just cited a paper here where people are using this model. When we're want to incorporate the impact of people, we can add this arrow here for pumping. We're pulling water out of the saturated zone, and the groundwater level is changing, and that can be measured around the wellhead. Engineers have inserted many pipes, and they can measure this groundwater level. There's a dozen or more pipes I know that are there that can be, that periodically people go and assess the groundwater level there. The USGS also has groundwater, permanent groundwater monitoring sites in Georgetown itself. One of the things I want to point out here is that there's a lot of, many arrows headed to evapotranspiration. And that turns out to be something that's harder to measure. A typical way to measure it is to have a flat pan with water in it and just ask how much water do you lose out of it every day. The water that flows over the land goes to water links and goes to the river. And the flow in the river is pretty easy to measure. That's pretty well known. Water flowing out of the soil to the water link is also something that we can differentiate between sort of a base flow in the river and these peak flows when you have big runoff. So I would say that this is part of the puzzle here, this evaporation and precipitation. To really understand what's going on, it would be great to have information about precipitation, evaporation, and groundwater. So I found one source of rainfall that we can illustrate what's going on with that to help us understand the overall problem. There are several other better sources that I've identified. I haven't gotten the data yet and been able to analyze it, but there are long-term records that were maintained by amateurs contributing to the national NOAA. And so there are data there. And there are also now many weather stations that have data that are maybe 20 years old that will help us in the long term. And the rainfall, of course, is spotty. So it's a little bit difficult. Sometimes it'll rain in Ipswich, but not in Georgetown. It'll rain in Newburyport, but not in Georgetown. So rainfall is a little bit spotty. Sometimes there are, especially in the summer when you get thunderstorms passing through. But the basic point I wanted to illustrate here is that rainfall is pretty uniform throughout the year on average. There are, of course, huge differences between years. And to really understand what's going on in those drought years, I'll need to have not an average for month, but I'll need to have yearly data, which are available. With regard to evaporation, I found a couple sites that have some data. And what you see here is that evaporation is large in the summer months. And that's not surprising in the sense that it's sunny and warm then, and evaporation is driven by the sun and by the air's ability to hold moisture. When it's cool out, the air can't hold very much moisture. Humidity is, people are very familiar with dry skin in the winter in their houses and outside. It's just not very moist. The air's not very moist. But as the temperature rises from May all the way through September, it's much warmer and more humid, and evaporation is significant during the growing season. And the units here are 4 inches. In the top month in July, there could be equivalent of 4 inches of rain evaporated during that month. So going back to the previous slide, all the rain could be lost by evapotranspiration this month. So that means the river doesn't get any net rain. There's nothing coming into the river because it's all getting evaporated. So that's why another reason why the summer months are difficult, because evaporation is high. And that's reflected a little bit in these data here. I've gotten a few data from about water level from the USGS gauge, and plotted the mean and range here. This is and 25 to 75% variability in these data, and this is just in feet. So the maximum here is only 80.5 feet, and the minimum is only 77 feet. So this goes up and down over the course of a year, but the mean only changes by a foot and a half. It's not much more than that. However, you can see on some years it goes more than that. Here is 2001. I just picked a year to show variability. You can see in 2016, which was a low year, that's when we had drought in the river, it was very low. It started out very low on the bottom end of records and was record setting for most of the summer until October. In 2022, it was at the bottom, started out median at the beginning of the year, and then came along here. There were a couple records. It goes up and down here because there are a couple records in the month. But anyway, it drops here and drops and drops and drops. And by August, it was very low. And I haven't gotten the data yet, but the data will show it's low through here because it stayed low. Although through this time period, it was quite low. So this groundwater data might be a good indication of the severity of a drought. I added a couple more years just to see how much difference it made. And you can see how in 1999, when we had some drought, we got rain and it popped way back up. Okay, I found just a few data on climate change, and I wanted to end by talking a little bit about that. I haven't been able to mine the data yet for rainfall and river flow. There are efforts by a team in Amherst to do that. My initial look says their analysis is not refined enough that what we do ourselves here will give us better predictions. But if you see here just the temperature change, we can see there's a predicted increase in temperature that's going to happen. And we know that will eventually be significant in summer because those higher temperatures will drive evaporation and the need to water. So this slide is just suggesting to us that the time of year in the summer when we lack water, we've lacked water so far, is going to increase. And I think the last, maybe one more slide. Yeah, this is changes in spring precip. I have this one slide, and they predict there's going to be more rain coming. So it doesn't say anything about the fall, summer, but they're predicting more rain for our area, which is something that may in the long run help us. We'll have to see. Okay, here's some more data. Number of observed warm nights increasing. Here's the United States, and here's Massachusetts. So it looks like warm nights are going up, more need for air conditioners to be comfortable. And so what I'm doing is I'm working with other people at UMass Boston, Dr. Karen Ricciardi, who's a modeler, and Dr. Ellen Douglas, who's a hydrologist. They're both in School for the Environment, and we're hoping to we're going to seek funding from the Water Resource Research Institute at Amherst who helped fund this initial work with a small $6,000 grant. And we're hopeful we can get some money and do a real model that would put more confidence in the impacts of pumping and how we could solve that for now and into the future, with the ultimate goal of having a site where anybody could go and look and click a few buttons and see what the predicted flow on the river would be, to see how low the flow might be. And we'd like to do this both for the Parker and the Ipswich. It's nice to have two rivers which have similar characteristics. The Ipswich is significantly bigger, but both are small rivers in the scope of rivers in Massachusetts. But both have long histories now of suffering low flows in the summer. So I'm not sure if this corner of the state is just getting fewer for some reason. There's some fine scale reduction in rainfall, but I think it'll be an interesting test case for the impacts of climate change. And I'd like to just end the big message with this picture again of this slide about sort of our tendency to want to be able to take out of the environment without understanding the consequences for all the parts of nature that sustain us. For some of you may have heard the term ecosystem services, which are all the things that nature does for us that aren't on our economic balance sheets yet. There are people arguing for that, but still most of our economic forecasting is done with the idea that we can take it, use it, and put it back with no consequences. And that's just now, from a biological perspective, environmental perspective, just a poor assumption. It's just wrong. So whatever happens, we'll have to convince our friends and neighbors that we need new ways to use water more efficiently and to reduce our impacts on the environment, or it will cause further deterioration of the environment. I'd like to end by thanking people who've been part of this: the USGS, Answered Questions, Town of Georgetown, Water Resource Center in Amherst, Ipswich, and Parker River Clean Water Associations in UMass Boston. And I'm here to answer questions. I know we have a little bit of time before we have to end, so I'm going to stop sharing this and just open up for people to share their concerns or questions or ideas. This is something that we have to solve as a community. We can't solve this. No scientist is going to solve this, or no watershed association is going to solve this. It has to involve the water departments and the populace as a whole.
Hi, Rob. Should I chime in?
Please do. Hi, Robert. How are you?
Thanks. Good to see you. Yeah, I've seen with the have you been working at all with the LTER project? I know they're very much attuned to at least there's a weather station and following rainfall, and I've seen graphs that had produced through that project of the increasing storminess or intensity of storms, similar to the graph that you showed early on in your presentation. So I just thought that seemed like obviously room for collaboration there.
I think that's true. Ellen Douglas is a former member of that LTR team, and I'm aware of the data because I've downloaded some of that before. But what I should do is work to find the people who have analyzed some of that data. One of the things that I do know too is that I have my own Davis weather instrument, and that there are a number in the watershed. And if I can, those usually are people, if they are showing those, there's an app you can see those data all the time. And if I could get those data, then I might be able to see some of the spottiness in the rainfall. There's a 100-year record in Ipswich of rainfall that I'm hoping to get to, that might allow us to at least get back to the beginning when they started measuring river flow. Anybody else?
I also thought was just a follow up though is the drought in the 1916 seems very pronounced based on what you presented, and I know that was about the time that the DMF's monograph was produced for the Parker River, which is, for at least for some people, is a sort of a baseline of resources in the Parker, and it was actually done during a period of drought. So yeah.
That would be interesting to see. I don't know that monograph. If you could share that reference, that would be helpful. There was somebody who had said to me that the actual rainfall was less during that period, but the river flow was not as affected, suggesting that changes in land use practices or water withdrawal by communities was not as intense. I haven't been able to find records of pumping very far back. The records, George Kaminsky thinks they exist somewhere in the state bureaucracy, and I have to go digging. We have to go digging for that information.
Hello, Dr. Stevenson. It's Ross Povenmire. Do you think that there's any place for interbasin transfer of water to alleviate low flows in one stream if there's capacity in a different stream? Is that something that has been given any thought?
Well, I'll comment by saying it's how Boston survives. Without that, Boston wouldn't exist, or almost all our centers of population. So as a culture, we've adopted that widely. That being said,
just to interrupt, you had mentioned this sort of spottiness of the actual rainfall experienced. So there are regional differences within the region of actual rainfall experience. If this translates into different flows in different rivers, then that's what prompted my thought.
Yeah, there's certainly true. And big rivers sort of average the flow because rain falls in one fork or another fork. So, if you were to look at larger rivers in Massachusetts, you would see there's not that much variability because it's averaged across different climate experiences, whether it's rainfall or melting or things like that. So it tends to have this averaging effect. In the Parker, though, the amplitude of the changes seems very large. It seems as though it doesn't have that, and I don't quite understand that property. When there have been earlier discussions about transfer from the Parker, say, to another town or something like that, I would say that the time when the Parker needs the water is the time when people want to transfer the water. So I would think that would be a mistake, that would really hurt the health of the ecosystem, the Parker ecosystem, to transfer water out of it, or to transfer water out of the Ipswich, which has also experienced extremely low flows. And they did again this past year. So I think transfer out of the basin has severe impacts on the other services that the ecosystem can provide.
Certainly.
There could be an economic analysis of that, which might help draw in a broader audience. If you were to look at all the services that the river provides in the summer, and then ask what are the economic consequences of that, you might show that conservation was actually a better strategy. It doesn't seem to be first thing people think about. Our culture is used to being able to get what it wants, but I think in the future we're going to have to think harder about how to have more efficient ways of using water and recycling it.
Yeah, there's a North Shore Water Task Force, which I'm sure you're aware of, and they're trying to develop some sort of a coordinated approach to using water in our region. And I don't know, I mean, they're very forward-looking. They have a long time horizon, and it just strikes me that there may be some room to look at using water from those sources most able to accommodate it. If there's a choice, that probably involves additional infrastructure and so forth, but that's sort of something that comes to mind.
Thank you for that, mentioning that. I think that that's something that in the long term is very important to consider, and there may be expertise that that we could marshal to help think about the availability and use of water and its consequences for natural systems. The reports that I've read that the USGS did, they're a couple decades old now. You or Robert might be able to correct me about the exact dates. I think they're the early 2000s, in which they analyzed the Ipswich River, the consequences for the Ipswich River. The take-home message for me is that the river goes dry and the fish fauna turns to a pond fauna. It loses its whole fauna, fish fauna and river fauna that's riverine. It becomes totally different. Going one step further and trying to evaluate what that means, you'd have to, I think, start conversations with people like Trout Unlimited and people who have a canoe business or that kind of thing.
There's also dissolved oxygen issues when you get those in that situation where there's no flow. So there's water quality as well as quantity issues.
Yeah, that's something that George Kaminsky is always reminding me of. Low flow has lots of consequences for water quality as well as water, not just water quantity. Yep. They're linked. Anybody else have a question I can or a discussion point?
One of the things that strikes me with the Parker, and if you look at that monograph that I mentioned, I hate to keep harping on it, but shows pictures that there used to be a smelt fishery and ice houses on the Parker River, which obviously that's long gone. It's just a consequence of climate change there. And apparently that was I'm sure old timers in the area would know about it, but that used to happen as part of the culture of the area.
Mm-hmm.
No longer exists.
Yeah. Well, I for some reason I might have heard of that monograph, but I haven't read it. So I will make a point of finding it and reading it, because I think the long-term perspective often gets forgotten, and over time we just have new expectations about what the ecosystem was like. When I've read very old monographs, there were lots of things we had that we don't have now. The most compelling one I've read was about bears foraging in the intertidal for 20-pound lobsters. So Martha, please speak up.
Good morning, and thank you for this really interesting presentation. I've been asked to ask a question on behalf of somebody else who's online and is having technical difficulties. So the question is, how significant would it be to recycle gray water? to help with all of this?
In some places in the world, that's a time-honored method, and people use gray water for other kinds of uses for which maybe bathing or drinking are inappropriate. So the whole, so I think it's a realistic possibility, and I think it depends on particular techniques and infrastructure and commitment by society to enable that. I think there are many barriers. For instance, a lot of people would be initially opposed to that. I think it would seem like, I don't want dirty water, I just want to get rid of it. But it does work, and whether it would be adopted depends on how the costs and how easy the technology is to implement.
I mean, one of the things that we're doing as Ipswich River Watershed Association is encouraging towns to think about water conservation, especially as it pertains to new developments, because it's a lot easier to think about gray water reuse in new buildings than trying to retrofit olds that require dual plumbing systems and all of that. And that's where the towns could have, you know, make a big difference in the amount of water used at individual developments. And we already think about this in terms of energy efficiency and requiring standards around energy efficiency to reduce energy use. And can we do the same thing for water to reduce water consumption at our new properties?
Excellent point.
Thank you.
I don't know how many people saw a recent article. I think it was, well, both the Times and the Post, Washington Post, about a community in New Mexico that was being served by a municipal water system. However, the community was outside the municipal limits. And so they had some sort of a contract. The water situation there is so dire that the water company has cut off the water to this particular development outside the municipal limits. And so they are having to truck in water and so forth. So it's an interesting case study, and well, it's not a study, but it's an interesting situation, which we probably will be hearing about more and more, and it points up the fragility of some sources of water that people count on. When times get tough, things can change, and you can suddenly find yourself without water. Hopefully it won't come to that for a while.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was Scottsdale, Arizona, that
Thank you.
town. And it also, the other part of that story was, it's been this area that's now cut off with water has been rapidly developing and advertised, and a lot of people moving into it. So it's sort of a new development
Yeah.
that never took water into consideration. So
I'm just going to jump in because I do need to log off at 11, which is in 3 minutes, and I am the host of the meeting, so possibly that will mean you all have to log off at 11. But I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially thank Rob for presenting. I think it's really interesting, all the work that you're doing. And this Zoom meeting has been recorded, so we can post it on the Pie Rivers website. So we'll have that link if you want to share it with anyone who wasn't able to make the meeting today. Rob, do you have any kind of final things you want to say before I log off?
Just thanks for people to come for coming, and that solutions will have to be a community discussion. And I hope to continue participating in the community, offering some insights.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
All righty.
Have a
Bye,
good day,
everyone.
everyone.